Hi, my name is Kate Edwards, and I'm a 30-year veteran of the video game industry. I'm a geographer who has been doing culturalization work on games, meaning that I adapt them for different cultures around the world. In addition to that, I spent 5 years running the International Game Developers Association and also spent 3 years running the Global Game Jam, which is the world's largest game creation event. Well, for me, I've always been interested in games because I was a gamer when I was very young. Back in the days of the video game arcades in the 1980s, I was very fond of playing video games because we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers. So basically our social time as teenagers was spent playing video games in the arcades. But I never at that time aspired to work in the game industry. It was only years later when I ended up working at Microsoft as a cartographer, working on a card encyclopedia, that I was eventually, through my work at Microsoft, pulled into the work on video games. So the first game I ever worked on was Flight Simulator 5.0 back in 1993. And that was really exciting for me as somebody who loved games to be able to actually work on a game. But even when I did that, I didn't know that I would end up working on other games. But then slowly, as I was still working at Microsoft, more and more work on games came to me. And eventually, by the time I left the company, I had worked on most of the company's major games like Halo and Age of Empires and Fable and many other titles. And so that's when I really found that working on games and doing culturalization work on games is really the best job I could ever imagine for me. To create a team, and to especially have a dream team to create a game, you do need to have the core creative team. So, for example, a lot of the small indie teams that I know, they have at least one artist and one programmer and one writer who might also be the game designer, because you need a game designer. You need somebody who actually understands and came up with how the game is going to be played and how it works. So I would say at most minimal, you need 3 people: artist, programmer, game designer. And like I said, the game designer could also be the writer who creates the narrative of the game. But typically it's more than 3 people. A lot of indie teams will maybe have 2 programmers, 2 artists. They might have somebody who's a specialist in user interface and user experience, so they can make the gameplay even better for the player. And then you have somebody who is usually serving a producer role. So their job is to basically make sure that the game stays on schedule and stays on budget as it's being developed, because having someone in that role is really important. And it's very true of like other forms of creative media where they have a producer who oversees the production and the schedule, and then you have the creative team who's actually focused on making the actual game. And so I would say those are the most minimal roles, what I would see on a game. Ideally producer, a couple of programmers, a couple of artists, and a game designer. And I would say if you at least have that group of people, then you're set up for probably making a good game that will do well. Well, storytelling is really the core of what we do in game development. A lot of people think it's the actual game design or like how you jump up from one level to another, or things like that. Those are all certain important aspects of creating a game, but ultimately games are storytelling, just like other forms of creative media. And so in order to tell a story, obviously you have to tell a good story because you really want to engage your audience and have people interested in the story that you're telling. Because if they have interest in the subject matter or they have interest in like what the gameplay might be like because of the story, that's what draws people in and makes them interested. And so you really have to start with the story. And from the story, or the narrative as we'll call it, from that narrative comes the game design. So what kind of game will fit best for that story? For some stories, it's a role-playing game. For other stories, it might be a first-person shooter. For other stories, it could be a real-time strategy game. It could be a puzzle game, a point-and-click kind of game. So there's all these different types of game genres and game designs that you could use, but you really have to focus first on the story and what best method will convey that story to the player. And that is really kind of the core challenge of game development, is figuring out what kind of method, because unlike other medium like film, you have one method you put the story on film. But with games, because they're interactive, you have a lot of different ways that interactivity can play with the story. And so you have to think really carefully about what kind of method is going to work best. And that's, to me, the beauty of games and what makes games really unique compared to other creative media. And that's why I feel that they are really on the forefront of defining how human beings tell stories from one generation to another, because it has that interactive component that is very different from other forms of creative media. But that's where we are different as games, but where we're similar is that you have to start with the story. Success of a game is really tricky. There are so many different market forces that influence why a game gets popular or why it might get that level of success that, of course, everybody is hoping for, because every game developer wants their game to be successful. They want their game to be enjoyed by as many people as possible around the world. But sometimes there are factors out of your control. So the factors that are under your control are the game design, the story, the art, the gameplay, all of those things. Even if you did your absolute best with those, once the game is out there on the market, whether you release it, on a console or PC or mobile device, whatever the platform is, the real challenge then becomes discoverability. Because how does your game get discovered by the players? And that's a common problem that all games face. Even the large AAA games that are released by Sony and Microsoft and Nintendo, they too have a discoverability issue. The only difference between them and most smaller developers is that these big companies have a marketing budget. So they can spend a lot of money on advertising, in all kinds of different ways. So they get the game in front of people on the side of buses and at bus stops and on television and, in all kinds of other places. So for smaller developers, usually how they get more success with their game is they build their community as they're making the game. So they basically engage a group of people who enjoy their game, like let's say it's the people that they play tested with first. So you get some people who are enthusiastic about your game's vision and the story, and then as you are developing the game, you try and grow your community, which is where social media becomes very important. It's also why some developers, they like to crowdsource their funding. So like they'll use platforms like Kickstarter in order to raise money for development. And then as they're using Kickstarter, the real purpose of those crowdsource methods, it's not to raise money, it's actually to build a community. That's really what they're there for. So you have a big enthusiastic community who's waiting for your game to come out. And then when the game does come out, hopefully you delivered exactly what they were hoping for. And then you get the word of mouth and everyone is telling each other, hey, you have to play this game. It's really cool. So that discoverability issue, sometimes it's out of our control because there's things that happen. Like, let's say all it takes is one influencer who decides to play your game, and all of a sudden your game just explodes in popularity because of one person. And that happens, as we've seen. So there's no magic formula for how your game becomes successful, but the best you can do is make the best game you can possibly make, and then, see what happens when you release it. One of the biggest technological advancements that comes to mind for me is the fact that we have these game engines that have become democratized. So you have engines like Unreal and Unity and Godot and others where they have become freely available to developers. And that really has caused this massive widespread democratization of game development. So in the old days, and I mean old days like maybe 10, 15 years ago, you still had to pay for a lot of the game engines. So there was already a barrier for a lot of people around the world who could not afford to use one of these game platforms. But now most all the game platforms have a model where you can download them for free. There's tons of education you can find on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram where people are showing you how to use these tools. So I have met around the world as I travel a lot, so many people who have educated themselves on how to build a game using these free tools. And to me, that has completely changed the game industry, because in the old days, you had the main console companies like Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo. They basically had control over a lot of the game development. But today, most of the games we see, especially the really innovative, cool games that are doing different things, those are coming from the smaller developers in all kinds of places around the world. And that's all because of that, making those engines freely available. And so we've seen this widespread adoption of game development, which honestly is amazing to me, because that has really been probably the key factor that has allowed game development to spread to pretty much every corner of the earth. In much the same way that having a good smartphone, there's people who make good films using a smartphone. I have worked on, at this point, 268 games in my 30 years. It's a lot of games, and a lot of those are big AAA games through Microsoft and Sony and Ubisoft and EA and a whole bunch of others. And I've had so many great experiences on so many games. I mean, there's some games that are a real joy to work on because I personally love that kind of game, like the Halo universe. When I worked at Microsoft, I really loved that universe. I loved the storytelling in that game. So it was really fun to work on those games. I love Assassin's Creed. I got to work on one Assassin's Creed title. That's been one of my favorite game series, just because I love the mix of history and geography. I think they've done such a great job with Assassin's Creed. Other projects that I've worked on, there's franchises that are near and dear to my heart, like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. So getting to work on Star Wars: The Old Republic with BioWare was a phenomenal experience. I worked on that for 4 years, and I'm currently working on the Indiana Jones game that is being made by Bethesda and Machine Games. And as a huge Indiana Jones geek, that's been super fun to work on. There's just so many projects. I mean, Age of Empires, that's also a great one that I've worked on, because that, again, getting to deal with real history and real geography, but putting it in the form of a game, that is a real challenge, but it's a really fun challenge to do it right. And so to be able to collaborate with so many people to bring these projects to life has been super fun. And honestly, if I look back over all of these projects, I have so many great memories, and there's a few not so good ones. I've worked on games that I don't like. I'm not going to name what they are, but there's some projects where I just don't like that kind of game. But for me, it's a job. You do your job, even if you don't like the game. But the thing that's really special among all the projects is the people I work with. And that's what I think about the most when I look back on these projects. I get to work with incredibly talented people, amazing skill, and I'm just in awe of their abilities, the artists and the designers, and the programmers, and everybody that I get to work with. And because my job is a little bit different, it's just I'm kind of coming from the outside as a geographer doing my culturalization work. But the fact that I get to interact with all these amazing people is really what makes, on some level, it makes every project really special. A lot of employees, because the environment right now with the economics and everything on a global scale has challenged the game industry to a certain degree. And so I think the industry right now is in a process of looking at itself and deciding, what is the best way to make games? Do we need to spend that much money? Do we need to, make that kind of effort in order to still deliver a game that people are going to play? And, that assumption is being challenged by the indie space, where you see many, many great indie games being made from all around the world. And many of these small games from small studios of like 5 to 10 people have become incredibly successful. And so if you're able to deliver that kind of success with a small, agile team, do you really need to have these massive 100,000 people teams to make these giant franchises? So that's something that the industry's thinking about a lot, is like, what kind of games do we want to make? What kind of games are popular? That's always something that, this industry is chasing, and it's not something that's easy to figure out. I think there's a lot of churn, so to speak, around that. But another thing that we're always looking towards is technological changes. So basically the technology that we base our games on, because we are a technology-based medium. And so technology is constantly changing for us. So we've seen, of course, in the last few years, sort of the rise and fall of virtual reality as one of the extensions of games. I still believe that virtual reality is going to be a key technology for us, and it hasn't gone away. It's still being used, but it's just the widespread consumer adoption is a problem because the hardware is expensive. And a lot of people don't have that kind of money to buy a headset and everything. But it's still a very viable medium, just like augmented reality too, has been really successful on a smaller scale. When you look at things like Pokemon Go and other games that have been successful with augmented reality, we're seeing the beginning of that. I think we'll see more and more as we go along. So, and of course, with AI, I mean, the rise of AI, especially generative AI technology, that is going to be quite an influence on the game industry. And so right now, just like the film industry, games are trying to figure out how do we incorporate that technology in an ethical and responsible way, because it is a technology that's not going to go away. It is a huge empowerment to the creation process, but we want to do it in a way that is responsible. And is not violating copyright of people's works. And so that's a challenge that is being discussed very much so right now in the game industry. So again, a lot of technology changes coming around, and we always look forward to see how can we adopt those into our process. Well, this has been an amazing experience coming here through the Creative Speakers program. It's been super fun to visit. It is my first time in Moldova, and to interact with the students here and interact with the staff. It's been fantastic to get a much better idea of how the game industry and the game development ecosystem works here. I know it's kind of in a nascent form, but it is here and there is work being done that it's really exciting to me. The students, interacting with the students has been awesome because it's just, you've got all this amazing talent, and more importantly, you've got a hunger for people who want to learn games, they want to develop games, and basically learn, how do I do it better? How do I get my game out there? And so I think that's the right place to be. You have to kind of have that mindset of being hungry for the knowledge and to always improve yourself and do better and better. And that's the same as anywhere else in the world where, people are trying to do a better job at their games. And I think Moldova has just as much opportunity and chance as anywhere else in the world. I visit a lot of places around the world where game development is just getting started. And, at the end, the consumers, the players who play these games, they don't really care where the game is from. And that's really important, I think, to emphasize, is that I meet a lot of developers, and I even had that question from some students here where they're saying, well, will anybody play our game if it's coming from Moldova? Or will somebody care that, we're just coming from this country, Moldova? I'm like, it doesn't matter. What matters is a good game. And good games can be created by any place, by any developer, anywhere. Making a good game is the challenge. So basically, you have to focus on just make a good game with good game design. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't really make any difference because we've seen successful games come from people from all over the world. And honestly, when a player is playing the game, they don't know where it was made. There's still a lot of Americans who think Angry Birds was made in the US. Why? Because it was so successful. So they don't know it was made in Finland. So, and that's my point. It doesn't matter that Angry Birds was made in Finland. It's important to Finland, but it's for the players, it's not as important. So what you really have to do to be globally successful is do the fundamentals, focus on making a really good game. And once you have that, then you put it out to the world and see how it does. I've read so many books that are impactful, but to me, I think one book that is really critical for a lot of people, especially if you're going to be a game designer, work in the game industry, is I really recommend The Theory of Fun by Ralph Koster. This has become a really standard book in a lot of game design schools, not just in the US, but in other countries. It's a really great book. I think he just came out with a new edition recently. And it's, as it says, The Theory of Fun. It really gets down to the fundamentals of what makes a game a good game and what makes it fun and what makes it playable. So I highly recommend that book. And other than that, one of my favorite books of all time is Dune by Frank Herbert. One of the reasons I like that book so much is because it's a phenomenal example of world building. And that's really what games are. If you're making a game, you are building a world. And so I highly recommend, reading, if you don't read science fiction, I recommend a lot of great science fiction. Dune by Frank Herbert, the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. These are like older sci-fi books, but they're classics, and so many people love them because the world building is so great. And so you read these books, and of course you've got J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. That's one that most everybody has read as a good example of world building. But I think for game developers, it's really important to read books like this, these books, fictional books, because it gives us inspiration on all the elements that it takes to build a good world and to build a world that people want to come back to and keep playing in. Just like many of us have, we reread Lord of the Rings or we reread Dune many, many times. Why? Because it's almost like replaying a game. We want to go back and go through that experience again. So I would really focus on those couple of books as a place to start for inspiration. My primary advice that I would give to people who are starting in the industry and are excited about working in the game industry is a couple of things. I mean, one is that you have to practice your craft. I meet a lot of people who say, I want to work on games, I want to develop a game, I want to design a game, but then they wait. They don't do it. They're waiting to get into a school or something. But honestly, if you look across other forms of creative media, let's say in art, let's look at art. People who want to do art, they do drawings, they do paintings. They don't wait for somebody to tell them to do it. And so I think it's really important, if you have that fire and the passion to work in the game industry, then you should already be working on games. You should already be thinking of ideas. If you're an artist, you should already be drawing and building your portfolio. If you're a programmer, you should be learning and trying out different code. If you're a designer, you should be thinking about different kinds of game designs, based on different stories or whatever you want to do. But it's really important to practice your craft and keep practicing over and over and over again. Because if you talk to some of the veterans in the game industry, even people who've been around 20 or 30 years like me, we often feel like we're still learning and we're still trying to do better at what we do. So we don't get comfortable in our skills. We keep challenging ourselves, and that needs to start right now when you're at the beginning of your career. The other thing I think is very, very important is that the game industry is a community of people, and we all love games, and it draws us together, and we have that mutual love of games. And because of that, we collaborate with each other. Every game that gets made, with some exception, but almost every game that gets made is made by a group of people. So you have to learn to work together. You have to learn to collaborate with each other. That's why you should be doing game jams and hackathons and things like that, because those are great ways to practice teamwork and working together with a team. And also what's really important is be humble enough to ask for help. Because one of the things I love about this industry, even when I've worked at places like Microsoft, is people don't have any shame about asking for help. Because if you get stuck with a programming problem, or you don't have an idea, as an artist or something, don't be afraid to go to somebody and ask for help. And if you see somebody like in your class or somebody around you who you think has a better skill set than you, don't be envious of it. Go to them and say, hey, would you be interested in being my mentor? Can you show me how to do that? Because seeking out mentorship is one of the key ways that we learn and we get better. And again, mentorship is not just for people starting out in the industry. I've mentored people who've been in the industry for 10 or 15 years. And that's, again, because they have a desire to keep improving their skill. So those are a couple of things I really recommend that you keep in mind as you go into the game industry. Is like you really should keep improving your skills and keep asking for help to improve those skills, because this industry is really friendly with each other and we really like to see everybody succeed. And that's, again, one of the reasons I love this industry so much. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to be here and experience the unique culture that is here and just interact with the great talent that is already, I can see, emerging in this place. And so I'm really looking forward to a chance to return to Moldova again, whether it's through the Creative Speakers program or any other way, but I'm looking forward to it.